Testing. We're live. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first of our Gen Con presentations, which is on the FLQ in Quebec. And our speaker with us today is Mike Tucker, one of the NSDM staff. And I will be curating questions and helping with the slide deck. So I'm going to pass us off to Michael now. So here's Michael's slides.
Hey, everyone. I'm going to give us a few seconds, Merle, so that, you said that there was a delay.
Yeah, the actual broadcast lags about 40 seconds. But that's okay because they'll be able to see it continuously and be able to ask questions in the chat.
Okay. Merle is going to handle the questions in the chat because I'm going to be sort of concentrating on what's going on.
We already have several hellos from some of our fans.
So I was born in Montreal before the crisis started. I don't want to say how much before, but well before. I'm going to run through a disclaimer. Just hang on a second. I got to pull that window up. And so I was born. I lived through the crisis. I do not name any of the FLQ people in this presentation because they're basically murderers and terrorists and what have you. And they don't need any more 15 seconds of fame. Please note that because I went through the crisis, and especially for my grandfather, who was much more intimately involved in dealing with the crisis, I have certain prejudices against the FLQ people. So I want to be upfront about that. And away we go. It didn't start on October 16th, but that's the point where it became the FLQ or October crisis, depending on who you want to listen to. In response to the kidnapping of both British diplomat James Cross on October 5th and the subsequent kidnapping of Quebec Labor Minister Pierre Laporte. So there's James Cross. That's actually when he was in captivity with the FLQ. And there's Pierre Laporte. He was the Quebec Labor Minister. He's also the deputy premier of the province of Quebec. Think of it as like he gets double hats, gets more money, I'm sure. At this point in time, the Canadian government announces the imposition of the War Measures Act. The War Measures Act dates from 1914 and hadn't really been changed that much since. It had been applied during wartime in both the First and Second Wars. Once the government announced the imposition of the War Measures Act, it allowed a lot of different things to happen that wouldn't normally happen in terms of law enforcement and rights. So the big one is everyone knows habeas corpus. You got a right to show us the body, as it were, and also the provisions of the Canadian Bill of Rights. It also expanded police powers, ability of the government to actually censor news, which we normally wouldn't do. And at the same time, they declared the FLQ an illegal organization, and membership in that organization became punishable by up to 5 years in prison. So there was no fooling around with some of these aspects of this. I want to give you a little historical context about Quebec and Canada, and it's a really odd thing in terms of how Quebec became English. As a result of the Treaty of Paris in 1763, at the end of the 7 Years' War, Great Britain was given control of what was New France, which in modern terms would be Quebec, around the St. Lawrence River, into Ontario, and then what are the modern day maritime provinces, Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. The British were actually had taken over a part of New Brunswick earlier at the end of 1755. I keep doing 18, I don't know why. 1755, and began clearing out the Acadians who actually were French and were living in that area. And some of them went to Quebec, where then they would be on the losing side of the next phase of the 7 Years' War. Some of them went ironically, to the 13 colonies. Some went back to France, but most of them ended up in Louisiana. And anyone who is a Cajun by birth is actually, Cajun is a corruption of the word Acadian. And they cleared out about 10,000 people, and it was not nicely done, shall we say. They burned places down, imprisoned the men, that kind of stuff. In contrast, for Quebec, which that would become Lower Canada as the British took over, they didn't do this. What they actually did is they sort of made an agreement that they would let the Catholics be. Don't forget, isn't that long since there's religious context between Protestants, Catholics, etc. And what happened from the populace is anyone who owned land, but that's all they had as an asset. Those who were at the government, like technically part of the aristocracy of France, because they could afford it, they went back to France. And it's no surprise that the first major American attack on British possessions in the Revolutionary War was the attempt in 1775 to capture the fortress of Quebec, which controls the St. Lawrence River and thus also controls access to the continent through the St. Lawrence waterway, through the Great Lakes, etc. The attack, led in part by one Benedict Arnold, they captured Montreal. Arnold was actually following a different route up through uncharted Maine and eventually found the St. Lawrence River. And they tried to attack Quebec City, the fortress, in New Year's Eve, 1775. The attack failed, and Benedict Arnold went on to do other things. But the French were very much not in support of the American invasion, because generally the church, Catholic Church, which was very powerful in a social context, didn't like revolutions. In the War of 1812, there wasn't really in Lower Canada, what is now modern Quebec, there wasn't a lot of fighting. There were some Canadian, British battles around south of Montreal towards Lake Champlain. There was also naval battles on Lake Champlain, but a lot of the land battles were in what is now Ontario, but was then Upper Canada. And then in 1837 and 1838, there was a serious problem with the way the government was working, or not, both in Upper Canada and Lower Canada. But the problem in Lower Canada and Upper Canada was the same, in that basically the people who were running the government were running it for their own benefit. So in Quebec, or Lower Canada, the group that was running things was the Chateau clique, and all they would do is, you get this job, I get that job, and we keep the locals who aren't connected, we'll keep them out of it. And the same thing was going on in Upper Canada. In Lower Canada, the British actually sent in the troops. In fact, they took most of them out of Upper Canada because the population difference was so high. And there were a couple of battles fought between British troops and patriots, as they would call them, and blood was shed and people were killed. And in fact, the Catholic Church refused burial of some of the dead of the rebels from on Catholic grounds. So they were sort of like, they were almost like excommunicating the dead. Canada, as you know it today, started with the British North America Act of 1867, but it had been a long negotiation between what it was then Ontario, which was West Canada, Quebec, then East Canada, and the Maritime provinces for 3 years, honestly. And Quebec had certain things guaranteed in the British North America Act in terms of so they wouldn't get outpopulated over time. They have a certain amount of seats in both Parliament and Senate guaranteed, and that's some of that still exists to this day. By the time the First World War rolls around, you know, the thought was that, you know, the French Canadians, oh, they're going to support France. To put the numbers out, before conscription was voted on in 1917, which caused other political problems, English Canadians volunteered for something like 126 battalions where French speaking and French, like the French battalions were actually French speaking. They got enough guys to make up 2.5, 3 battalions, and they were using them for the over 2 battalions. Only 2 battalions really were fought in France or Belgium in the First War. In 1917, with all the casualties of the last few years piling up, Canada staged a referendum, plebiscite, whatever you want to call it, on starting conscription. And it became very, very political. And pretty much the entire French-speaking population of Quebec voted against it. But there was enough votes in the rest of English Canada and English speakers in Quebec to pass the Conscription Act. And part of the thing that was cheesing people off is that a lot of the French Catholics were, not all of them, but a lot of them were farmers. So their labor for their young sons was needed on the farm instead of fighting the Hun in Central Europe. And this, you know, more bad blood between the English-French divide, as it were. In the Second World War, the government of the day was trying very hard not to impose conscription. And the prime minister of the day, Mackenzie King, it's a little weird. Talk about the seances to talk to his dead dog at some other day. But his attitude was conscription if necessary, but not necessarily conscription. And there was, again, another conscription referendum in 1942 that passed. Again, most of the folks in Quebec, French folks in Quebec, voted against that act. It wasn't actually become an issue until 1944, when the heavy casualties, we'll talk about some of that tomorrow in our 1945 lecture, were coming home to roost, and there was actually manning issues. And a lot of the guys who were conscripted or being looked for not registering for conscription were French Canadians. And some of them like went away, like just hid away. So you can see that there's definitely a divide from a political sense. There's also an economic divide. The English, because they've been there and they're on the top, so they're running a lot of the industry. The British have invested heavily in Canada, and after the war, that starts to change in that you get more American investment coming in, but that still means it's English type of investments. And relatively speaking, the French Canadians are the guys who are working in the mines, cutting the trees down, working the farms, what have you. And that's part of the discontent with that sets up things for the FLQ and other sovereignist organizations in the following years. So we'll talk a little bit about FLQ history and what the heck that they were doing at the time. And these really were formed in early 1963 from members of other pro-sovereignty. In other words, like Quebec should be independent and et cetera, who wanted rapid results. In other words, in a way, they wanted to break things and blow things up to, you know, foment change. And you know, they were a lot of their stuff was based on sort of resistance cells, you know, that you hear about. You know, there's a few guys here, a few guys there. You know, they've been reading classic um, urban guerrilla manuals, maybe also stuff from the Second War, Resistance. So that there were a number of different groups, subgroups that were involved, and each had its own sort of little half a dozen people, typically in one of the cells. And some of the cells were family, like there were two or three members of a family, whether it's a husband and wife or brothers, that were involved in each cell. So there was some, you know, loyalty elements, etc. Merle, are there any questions that I should be looking at before I dig deeper?
Not seeing any so
You
far.
good?
People can ask questions in the chat at any time, and I can highlight those for Michael.
And I need some water because it's hot in my office.
We do have one. Sure. There it is.
I can't see it. Okay.
Explain English type investments, please.
British had a long history of investing in Quebec, and most of the people who were running British subsidiaries, etc., at the highest level. So, you know, your chairman, CEO, VPs, etc., were English-speaking, typically Protestant, not exclusively, but for a large percentage of the time, that's how it was going. So they would, you know, invest the money, build the company, you know, set up the mine, whatever it happened to be, and they would employ the French, but you know, their employees, there's no share ownership or that kind of stuff. So that's how that was. And then the investment money after the Second War, and in fact, the government of Canada and Quebec were actively courting American investment in the country. So that's what English investment is. And for the most part, the money stayed in the English with the English Canadians or the British, etc. So the FLQ, less than 2 months after they've found roughly, these guys all get together roughly February of 1963, and they start with fire bombs first, and then actual, you know, dynamite kind of stuff that they'd stolen or acquired somehow, attacking federal and buildings and military buildings like armories. There's 3 regiments that are based in and around Montreal, and that was the sort of the starting point. They hadn't managed to kill anyone in the first few weeks, and they finally, unfortunately, killed William Vincent O'Neill at a bombing at the Canadian Military Recruiting Center. He was the night watchman. Furnaceman, is, you might see it if you look it up. He was basically keeping the furnaces going, and he was unfortunately killed by the bomb. And in a big escalation, and this is where my family connection comes in, and we'll have a couple of pictures in a second. The FLQ plants time bombs in the city of Westmount. The city of Westmount, think of it in your hometown. Where do all the rich, and in this case, Protestant and English people live within the city, in city of Montreal? Westmount is its own little enclave, has its own mayor, city council, fire department, all that kind of stuff. And they plant bombs in mailboxes in the city of Westmount. A number of them actually do go off, but 10 of them fail to explode. You know, early days, we're learning how these things work. And the ones that went off at like 3 in the morning. So it was just to cause trouble. They weren't at this point. I don't know whether it was they didn't want them to kill anybody or the bombs went off prematurely or what have you. And this is this picture is one of the bombs. You can see the mailbox in the background, surrounded by those sturdy bales of hay. And the figure, can I get over there? The second figure closest towards the camera is in fact my grandfather. At the time, he was the Commissioner of Public Safety for the city of Westmount, city councilor, and he was an engineer veteran from the Second World War. The chap in front of him, closer to the bomb, who's carrying a charge to disrupt the bomb like they do these days, except now we use more sophisticated methods, is a chap by the name of Walter Leha, and he's a bomb disposal expert of the time. And the reason they put it in mailboxes is that we're Royal Mail, not Canada Post as it is today. Unfortunately, not with this bomb, but one of the other bombs that he was in the process of defusing went off and severely injured him because it went off in his face, basically. And he lost his left hand and was severely disfigured. And just to show you that in this one, they actually did get, knocked the bomb down. But this is part of why I really don't like the FLQ guys, because indirectly they were trying to kill my family. And just to go further on, in 1964, my grandfather became mayor of the city of Westmount for the next till 1968. So, again, perhaps a little bit of a target on him. And just to tell you, in the city of Westmount, the mayor's house has 2 light posts out in front of it so that if some citizen is in need of assistance at night, they can find his house. Not a good security thing these days, but it was a thing back in the day in the city of Westmount. In June 1963, arrests are made of a number of FLQ members, including 2 who are imprisoned for the death of Mr. O'Neill. So the cops are trying to track these guys down, bust things up, and they are getting tips. They may have informants, and they're definitely looking for trouble. A separate group, but same sort of thing, called the Quebec Liberation Army, stages a series of bank robberies and amasses $100,000 in 1963-64 dollars, both in money, etc. 2 of these QLA guys are brothers of FLQ members, so there is some synergy, connection, whatever you want. And then another group called the Revolutionary Army of Quebec kills 2 store staff during an attempted gun robbery. All 5 members of this group are sentenced to life in prison, and some additional FLQ members are swept up at the same time, again because of links and associations. From 1965 to 66, more diverse political groups, small, socialist, communist, whatever you want, join the FLQ. Again, we're talking tens of members joining. The FLQ starts publishing a newsletter called Le Cogné, which English is like the strike, the hit, whatever you want to, your translation as necessary. But it wasn't exactly sophisticated, shall we say? It's a mimeograph thing. That's one of the issues, and they do interesting things, and it's propaganda, but they also, some of the material shows how they're building bombs, so they're distributing information about that. The RCMP continues to arrest FLQ members, but hey, the distance between Montreal, where most of this activity is happening, and the U.S. border is not that far, and some of them end up fleeing to toy boat to the United States. I'm going to give Merle another chance. Any other questions right now, Merle?
No, not at the moment.
Okay, cool. Just carrying on. In 1967, Charles de Gaulle visits Montreal and gives a speech, which, if you can see the guy in the background, who is the Jean Tapo, the mayor of Montreal, will not be happy about. The speech, which was not supposed to happen, in other words, he wasn't scheduled to speak at this balcony at City Hall of Montreal. Though apparently, according to some sources, he actually had prepared the speech. He was called out to the balcony by popular acclaim, like there's big crowds and everything for him being here, and he gives a speech which ends with "Vive le Québec, vive le Québec libre." So, in other words, yay Quebec, yay free Quebec. And again, my grandfather, because he's a mayor of a city within the city of Montreal, was invited to this thing. He'd served, he'd helped liberate France, and he took umbrage at this and left. And his wife was with him as well, and they both left after the speech. And if anyone doesn't think that Churchill's description of de Gaulle as his own personal cross of Lorraine isn't valid, there was no need for him to do this. And in fact, it set back French relationships between France and Canada even further. It was a bit cold at this time. For example, earlier in 1967, at the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Vimy Ridge in France, he didn't show up to the commemoration, to the remembrance ceremonies. So, just another way that he wins friends and influences people. We're going to move forward to 1968. Pierre Trudeau, father of the current prime minister, wins election as prime minister of Canada. Justin definitely got the better in the looks department, but I can't explain it to you if you've never seen it. This guy, I didn't particularly like his politics, but he had a personal magnetism about him. He was very well educated, very good speaker in both official languages, French and English. He was Montrealer, and he was smooth, very smooth, is all I can say. In that year, the FLQ is still continuing bombings. Again, it's sort of the stick of dynamite up against the railroad track, up against some sort of government building. They aren't hurting people much. 1969, they escalate. In early 1969, they actually bombed the Montreal Stock Exchange. And I've understated this. They actually injured more people, but 27 people were seriously injured, and the building was severely damaged. They also got a bomb into Jean Tapo's home in Montreal. Though the story goes that the cops couldn't find it because they put it in a toilet, and nobody wanted to look in the toilet. I don't know if it's true. It's a good story, though. Two FLQ members who've been hiding in the US hijack a plane out of New York to Cuba. But at that time, anytime anyone hijacked a plane, it was going to go to Cuba. But it is what it is. The FLQ is inciting riots against various English institutions like McGill University, English companies, etc. English-owned companies. Let me rephrase that. In 1970, in February, police arrest two FLQ members with pre-printed press releases indicating they were planning on kidnapping the Israeli Trade Council. Now, they didn't do it. I wonder what would have happened if terrorists tried to take on the Israeli Trade Council. I suspect it might have been a little less pleasant. And the guys that they arrest, they get bail and disappear. In May, a very young Robert Bourassa wins his first term as Premier of Quebec. And again, a smart guy, more of a technocrat than a hand with, compared to Trudeau in terms of a smooth talker. But he's still very popular and focused on improving the economy of Quebec. In June, police arrest 6 FLQ members with leaflets that announced the kidnapping of the U.S. Consul General in Montreal, Harrison Burgess. Their planned date was July 4th. Now, it's 1970. The President of the United States is one Richard Nixon. I'm curious to think, it's one of those thought exercises to see what Nixon's response would have been if that had actually happened. And Nixon and Trudeau, they got along in terms of political stuff, but Nixon called Trudeau a son of a bitch on one of his tapes, of course. Before I go on, I'm going to have some water because it's hot in my office. Any questions, Merle?
No, sir.
All right. So, in spite of all this, lead in that the FLQ are thinking about kidnapping diplomats in Montreal, things go from bad to worse in October. On October 5th, the British Trade Commission, we showed you a picture of him earlier, is kidnapped in front of his home by one of the cells, the Liberation cell of the FLQ, on his way out to go to the office in the morning. The list of demands is issued by the cell, including, there's more demands than these 4, $500,000 in gold, publication or broadcast of the FLQ manifesto, release of 23, they call them political prisoners, but a lot of them are the guys that have been arrested for other activities that are not necessarily. Sure.
Mike, we have a question. Are most of the violent actions limited to Montreal up to this point?
Not just Montreal, but 90%, because Montreal at this point in time is the largest city in Canada. Every major bank has its headquarters in Montreal. Most of the major insurance companies, where the money is, have money, their headquarters are in Montreal. There's a tax on statues in Quebec City of Queen Victoria, that kind of stuff. Railway tracks between Montreal and Quebec, or Toronto and Montreal, that kind of stuff. And I don't know what the exact percentage is. Most of it's concentrated on Montreal because it's where the English are, where the rich English are, rich English speakers are, and it's where the money is. And in fact, we'll talk about it at the end, but Montreal at this time, though it's not the capital of Canada, it's not the capital of the province of Quebec, that's still Quebec City. Montreal is vibrant, dynamic, and where the economy is being driven out of. The consequences of some of the things that happened after October crisis, which I'll touch on briefly at the end, will change this. The political prisoners, some of them were guys who were, bank robbers, killers, just bad people, and a provision of safe flight to Algeria or Cuba. No extradition between Algeria and Canada, and Cuba, and at that point in time, and Fidel Castro are making it very easy for people to hijack planes, that kind of stuff. on October 6th, there's more demands, but so on the 6th of October, the FLQ manifesto is published in French language papers. If you look online, you can find an English version, but basically it's a list. The manifesto isn't like, like the Unabomber's manifesto. It's basically a list of complaints about the power of the Catholic Church, the money that the Catholic Church has, that the English business interests and even French business interests are keeping your average Quebecois down on the farm, or wage slavery, whatever you want to call it. And it's a list of complaints about events that have happened over, some of it literally back to that 1837 rebellion, where the church wouldn't bury the rebels. That's brought up in the manifesto. So, like I say, it's a complaint list, and I haven't read it in French, and I'm sure it flows better in French. I've read an English translation, which you can find, but it doesn't, and it's fully annotated in terms of, when they're mentioning names, it'll be easy for if you want to look it up. I just don't want to read it because it's really, like I say, in English it doesn't scan well. Parts are published in English language papers, but the federal government, the government of Canada, is leaning on the English press and the French press not to do this. But it's not 100% successful. The French press is, they don't want Mr. Cross to be killed because they wouldn't put something in the paper. And then the feds kind of step in, because technically, some of this stuff would have to be a federal issue anyways, especially talking to Algeria or Cuba. But they step in and say, we're anything that's going to go on related to this incident, the decisions are going to be made by both levels of government. On that same day, the Liberation Cell, sends out a communique that we're going to kill Cross. We're going to execute him because he's British. If we don't get what we want. On the 7th, 30 folks are arrested by the police in Montreal, as they sort of try and wrap up some of the supporters, what have you. The manifesto is read on a French language Montreal radio station. Again, they were reading it so that, to take the burn off in terms of that the FLQ guys wouldn't kill Cross. And on October 8th, the manifesto is read on the national French language television, Radio Canada, which is the French language equivalent of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and is owned by the government of Canada.
So, Mike, we have a question.
Sure.
Questions. Did anybody ever figure out what de Gaulle was trying to accomplish with the speech?
Depending on who you listen to, he was being a jerk. He was tweaking the federal government, which was not happy with him. Somewhere in between lies the truth, I suspect. I mean, he, like I say, my opinion of de Gaulle is not very high. He's a brave guy, but when he becomes a politician after the fall of France, he becomes a bit of, if not a large jerk. And then when he's president of France later, they were actually trying to kill him because that's how popular he was, as well. So was he just being a jerk? Was he just trying to tweak the Canadian government, which wasn't happy with him? I can't tell you. it's, one of those things he probably took to the grave. But I think it's a bit of each. On October 10th, the Quebec Minister of Justice rejects the demand for release of prisoners, but agrees to let the FLQ guys give them safe conduct out of Canada. A separate cell in reaction to this, the Chenier cell, kidnaps Pierre Laporte, who is both the deputy premier of the province and also the labor minister. And he's kidnapped in the evening on his way back from a meeting of the government to discuss the crisis. So, it's 1970. Our security stuff sort of sucks. Why wasn't he guarded? He was by himself and abducted at gunpoint. So the 11th, they issue the Chenier cell, different group from the Liberation cell. They're not physically in the same places. They threaten to kill Laporte if all their demands are not met. If all the demands that had been issued when Cross was kidnapped. At this point, the federal government, on October 12th, calls up the army units in the Ottawa area to protect facilities in the capital and individuals in the capital.
So, Mike, we have another comment.
Sure.
This is from Doug again. He says, about the same time that de Gaulle made the speech, he'd lost the referendum election in France and resigned. Was that the provocation in Canada meant for French domestic consumption, do you think?
I don't know. I don't remember that it was 67, not 68, guys. I'm not sure about that referendum in France. I mean, the French system of government, it's very weird in terms of you elect a president, but you also elect a prime minister and ministers, but at different times and different formulas. I don't know. I thought that would have been 68, but I could be wrong. I probably am wrong.
I just checked. The referendum was in 69.
Okay.
And he resigned in April of 69.
Yeah. So, this was his visits to Quebec, both Quebec City and Montreal. He came across the Atlantic on a French cruiser. And he visited in 1967. Expo 67 was going on in Montreal. He visited the French pavilion there, and definitely from his point of view, he was trying to raise profile and look like a an international kind of guy and what have you. But again, courting controversy might not have courting the enmity of the government of Canada is not quite the same thing as like poking the bear or the Americans, etc. Any other before I carry on, Merle? Merle? Any other?
Yeah, Doug has another comment about the uprising in France was in 68 and he resigned in 69, but the problems were simmering as early as 67. And I don't doubt that. I just don't have any specifics. I don't know about you, Mike.
No, excuse me. No, I don't. Like I say, I haven't really, made a study of it, of that particular, of de Gaulle's political life at that point in time. So I whatever's on, Google was probably close to right. Any other things? So on the 12th, also negotiations begin between a lawyer representing the FLQ and a lawyer appointed by the federal government. Now, he's actually a Quebec Party senior official of the Liberal Party of Canada in Quebec. It's confusing, but in Canada, well, no, it's not really that confusing. It's just there's both federal and provincial parties that use the same names. And sometimes they're closely linked, as, for example, the United States, and sometimes they aren't as closely linked. They're just similar broadly in terms of policies. On the 13th, the negotiations actually that started on the 12th broke down. Trudeau's being interviewed by journalists, and this is a famous quote. And he was good at this kind of stuff. Well, just watch me. And in fact, earlier in the day, he'd been commenting about people who are complaining about troops in the Ottawa, and he used the term about bleeding hearts not liking this helmets in the city in the streets, and from a political perspective, he was very left of center politically. So it's sort of funny calling them bleeding hearts. By the 14th, there's all sorts of crazy rumors running around. Bomb threats. They found a cache of explosives. They found a bunch of caches of explosives. All sorts of weird stories. Oh, there's another cell of the FLQ that's going to pop up and kidnap somebody else. That kind of thing. And this is the kind of stuff that happens in times of crisis. A wide swath of French-speaking political and financial figures issue a statement urging superhuman effort in the negotiations, and at the same time saying that probably the negotiations aren't going well because it's Ottawa's fault. It's Washington's fault, it's Ottawa's fault, that kind of stuff. It happens everywhere in politics. Now, some of the political figures include three, not one, not two, but three future premiers of Quebec. So, they were politically involved, they were financially involved, but they did want to see the negotiations succeed. Any more comments, questions, Merle?
Yes, we have another one. Of those that were kidnapped, how were they treated by the FLQ?
That would be too early to tell you, because that happened. You'll find out in a couple of minutes. And the answer is, it depended which cell you were kidnapped by. On the 15th, the Premier of Quebec asked the federal government to provide troops under the National Defense Act. So the National Defense Act if a province requests it, the federal government can assist the provincial government, whichever province it happens to be, with using troops to do whatever it is they need. And that same day, incidentally, about the first day, about 1,000 troops are from regiments based around the Montreal area are brought in to assist the government. And I think that eventually it gets to 3,000 or 4,000 over the next few days as they move bodies around. That evening, there's a pro-FLQ rally that attracts some 3,000 students in Montreal. And sorry, let me go back a second. And this rally may have been one of the key things that, especially Bourassa, but also Drapeau, pointed to this as, well, there's 3,000, there's students. How many more, secret FLQ supporters are there? Do they have guns? That kind of stuff. And in fact, in the manifesto, the FLQ manifesto, they talk way boldly about having 100,000 people going after Bourassa in the future. quite honestly, the FLQ, the active guys even over those years were a couple of hundred. Now there were other people who would support them with money or give them a place to stay, that kind of stuff, and gain a few hundred more. It was never the level of movement that it became a sum of all fears. But this rally, 3,000 people rallying in support of the FLQ after all this stuff has been going on for 7 years, scares the heck out of a lot of people. And in fact, it's often cited as one of the contributing factors for the implementation of the War Measures Act. It's not the only big thing, but it's certainly a big thing that probably scared a lot of people when they saw this. The provincial government offers to parole 5 of the 23 prisoners demanded by the FLQ, because kind of sort of they were eligible for parole, assuming you give them all the maximum credit for good behavior, and the parole board didn't step in. But they're trying to negotiate this down. October 16th, the War Measures Act is invoked, and it, like I say, the police go in Montreal, and the RCMP and the other police forces within Quebec start a series of mass raids and arrests. And because one of the things that happens when you arrest all these people is you don't have to tell anyone that you've arrested them. You don't have to provide them a lawyer. You don't have to offer them bail. You don't have to tell them nothing for a period of time. On October 17th, the Liberation Cell issues a communique that James Cross's death sentence has been suspended. But the Chenier Cell murders Pierre Laporte. And this is a bit graphic, guys, sorry, and they dump him in an abandoned car. And there's a couple of different stories of why he was killed and how. Well, he was strangled to death with his own rosary. There's 2 stories as they just killed him because the War Measures Act was invoked. There's another story, and no one's ever going to know that once Laporte had heard that the War Measures Act had been invoked, he knew he was screwed and was killed trying to escape. I suspect it's the former rather than the latter. But this also points out the differences between the different cells in terms of their hardness, their political things, and the fact that the communications between them was definitely not free flowing. They may have been able to get messages to each other, but there definitely were different agendas between the 2 different cells. And the Chenier cell is like 5 guys, and the Liberation Cell is 6 or so. And basically, the Chenier cell communique calls him effectively the Minister of Labor, Minister of Unemployment, and basically says unpleasant things about him as a person. And this language turns many Quebecers who might have been more sympathetic to the FLQ against the FLQ. As the saying goes, you could look it up. And move ahead. Merle, I'll give you another chance. I'm going to.
There's no other questions except I have one. Do you have any idea how big the FLQ active membership was at that point in time?
Less than 100, probably 50, if that many. And what do you the guys that we know were doing the really bad things. These 2 cells was 11 guys between them. Actually, excuse me, 11 guys and girls. There were some women involved as well. The Other cells may have already been disrupted by the police raids. Like I say, maybe 100 active over the 7 years, maybe 150 supporters, sympathizers, probably a few hundred more, maybe, again, at the high end. So they provoked a crisis well beyond their fighting weight, if you know what I'm saying. And perhaps the government in Ottawa was a little overboard, but there were no consequences to the government. There's effectively a state funeral for Laporte on October 20th. On the 25th, democracy goes on in Montreal. Jean Drapeau wins 92% of the vote in municipal elections. Every council seat, 40 odd of them, he wins them all. His party wins them all. There was perhaps some suggestion that his opposition party, the opposition party to him, was sympathetic to the FLQ, and that may have affected, voters. And the turnout in this election was quite heavy. But Drapeau passes this test with aplomb. So for 10 days, the government has been holding people effectively incommunicado. They finally get access to lawyers. It's James Cross. Nobody quite still knows where he is. In November 6th, based on some tips, they capture a member of the Chandier cell. The stupid part of this was that the rest of the members of the cell were hidden in the same building behind a false wall, and they were not captured at that time. 2 months, pretty much, since Cross had been kidnapped. He's rescued by police. The members of the Liberation Cell were allowed passage to Cuba. Someone asked earlier about his treatment. The only bad thing for him, and maybe it was a good thing, was he'd lost weight. He was not tortured, he was not abused, and he was, at the press conference after that, he said he was treated very well. I'm sure he was bored out of his skull, but I'd rather be bored out of my skull than in the trunk of a car. Yes, so the Liberation Cell guys, all 6 of them, get to Cuba. The last members of the Chenier cell are captured at the end of December and go on trial. There's a variety of prison terms for these guys. Some get life in prison, some get only a few years, because some of the people who were supposed to testify, who were members of Chenier cell, renege on their plea deals, kind of thing, and they're given additional time, and they don't open up after a point. The federal government actually releases figures related to the arrests under the War Measures Act. 497 folks were arrested. 435 were actually released. 62 were charged with various offenses, and 32 of those that were charged were not given bail. So, some of the guys that they were arresting were writers, artists, actors, musicians, etc., who somehow were distantly, kind of, sort of, partially, maybe related, had expressed some interest in the FLQ, some support for the FLQ, but the bulk of them are released. And in fact, the province of Quebec, for a number of these people, provide compensation, mainly to deal with the damage caused when the cops broke in. Like they busted down the door, came in through the windows, whatever it was, and up to a maximum of about $30,000, $1970. So some people, who had their rights violated, etc., receive some form of compensation. Yes.
So
Sir?
we have a question. And the question was, were FLQ members from all parts of society or mainly from a homogeneous class?
For many of the members, especially a large percentage were lower class, lower middle class, labor class, that kind of stuff. There were some guys at the start, especially, that were more well educated, more intellectual, who figured that what was going on in the early '60s, it wasn't happening fast enough. So that's why they went to advocating violence. There was, allegedly, at one point in 71 or 72, 71, there was apparently a Black Panther who was arrested with other FLQ members. I looked at that and just went, well, okay, fellow traveler, what have you. But by the end of 1971, the FLQ is defunct. The police, Montreal police, have high-level informants, and they've basically gutted the organization. Some of the members of the Liberation Cell didn't enjoy the tropical workers' paradise of Cuba and show up in Paris. And in fact, eventually, I think all six of them eventually end up in Paris. Over the years, the late 70s, early 80s, they came back to Quebec. As soon as they land, they get arrested. They go on trial, and the average sentence is about 2 years. And part of the mitigating factor against harsher sentences was Cross's own testimony, press conference, what have you, where he said, they didn't do anything bad other than kidnapping. The ultimate consequence of this is that the Parti Québécois, which is a pro-sovereignty political party in the province of Quebec, wins the 1976 provincial election, defeating Robert Bourassa. The consequence for me personally is why I'm living in Toronto now, in Ontario. In 1976, after the election, property values in Montreal tank. A number of major banks and financial institutions, insurance companies, basically move their operations out of Quebec within weeks and months, that kind of thing. Sun Life is the one that gets a lot of bad press, but the Bank of Montreal, headquartered here since the 1700s or early 1800s, their headquarters now in Toronto, and was been for a long time. Basically, because of the uncertainty involved, and also the actions that the Parti Québécois takes after they win. If you're English, so one of the first things that they do, they say, so you can't have your children educated in English if you weren't educated in English, right? So if you're an immigrant from outside the provinces, it impacts that population very heavily. And a lot of people just get fed up. The other stuff that they start doing from a regulatory point of view, and you see it to this day, is they make rules around the language used on signs. So many of the major companies, retailers, etc., the classic one is Eaton's, EATON apostrophe S, so possessive. one of the, basically the Canadian equivalent at the time of Sears, becomes, in Quebec at least, Eaton. So the apostrophe and the S die. They're removed from signs because French has to be given more prominent place in everything. And it becomes silly in the workplace for my father that French becomes the the required daily language almost. Well, that's all fine and dandy, except my dad's an engineer and he's born in Montreal, speaks French, but not at a professional level. So eventually I get moved after finishing the last year of high school in Quebec, and the family moves to Toronto. And even today, well, a few years ago, I was working for a company that has offices across Canada, including Montreal. And every time, and I'm an IT guy, and every time we were buying equipment for Montreal or Quebec City, because we had offices down there or other locations in the province of Quebec, to make sure that the keyboard and Windows came up in French. And there's actually like a committee in the company in Quebec called the Francization Committee, which was basically to make sure that the keyboards were all French kind of stuff. Even if you're English and you're more comfortable with that, by default, everything had to be in French if it was running in Quebec. And we actually got screamed at a couple of times when we had some laptops that we were sending down on an emergency basis that didn't have French keyboards.
So we have another question.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is, how do the goals and actions of the FLQ compare to a group like the Red Army faction or the May 19th Communist Organization?
They were, the FLQ in their manifesto and their stuff was very much in favor of the worker. But especially because the worker was being exploited by the man. The big boss is what's used, an expression that's used in the manifesto, which means the English-speaking big boss. And they were very concerned about workers' rights, the fact that for the most part they were being treated, relatively speaking, as far as they were concerned, poorly compared to English workers. There was discrimination as they felt against French-speaking workers. Not, and I want to make a difference between French-speaking workers and workers who speak French. Right, so French-speaking workers means that their mother tongue is French, and even I was back in Montreal in a few years ago for a high school reunion, and I was talking to one of the guys, and he said, the French policies of the Parti Québécois. This was like '94 or so. So, he was running a business and he was, hiring people. And he told me the story about this this young woman who's just out of university, great looking, qualifications, resume for what she was doing when she was, work terms or what have you. But because of the Parti Québécois policies on language, she didn't speak English, or didn't speak it again at a level to conduct business. And these guys are doing all those things, except they fail to recognize that ultimately the world, business world runs on English, and taking the ability to speak English away from your people actually sort of cripples them from a professional point of view. The and what also happened is all this stuff related to language, even though the Parti Québécois would lose elections to the Liberals, including Robert Bourassa, who sort of came back, no one's really willing to touch a lot of the language policies and education policies. But eventually, I think that may change. It's been 50 years. A lot of the guys who were, not FLQ, but pro separation, pro Quebec sovereignty, Quebec independence, whatever you want to call it. Those guys are all, past their prime or dead. And I'm not talking just the little crazy people. I'm talking about the Parti Québécois and all those guys that were in there at the beginning when the Parti Québécois was formed in the late 60s. They're gone, and it's different generations.
So, Mike, is the demographic in terms of economics or things other than just the language difference still about the same as it was back in that period, or how has that changed?
It's changed. There's a lot less people who are like me, English, Protestant. A lot of them, like me, were either by family or by what have you, left the province because they couldn't work, or it was so difficult to work. So there's more immigrants. There's quite a sizable, for example, Haitian community in Quebec, and that's because, of course, Haiti, French is a spoken language there that all of them get to. There's also a third. It's a term you don't hear very often, and I haven't heard in a long time. And I don't know how big the percentages are these days, but there's Anglophones like me, English speaker. English was my mother tongue, whatever you want to call it. Francophones, and then there's a third category, and I don't know the numbers on this today, called allophones. So an allophone is someone who neither French nor English is his mother tongue or her mother tongue. And they were a percentage of the population, especially after 76 and through the 80s and 90s, but I've lost track of that. And in fact, in Quebec now, there's a different parties actually in charge than the Liberals or the Parti Québécois, and they're a more conservative, but weirdly conservative organization. And they've been pushing secularization, I would be the term to call it. In other words, that if you're an employee of the province, you may not wear religious stuff, whether that's a crucifix in the workplace. Excuse me, teacher, civil servant, DMV equivalent guy, bus driver, all those things, and it's been very controversial. But I mean, it's one of those things. And these guys are they're again a different sort of set of guys and girls in terms of what their philosophy is. And I think some of it's pushback because, for a long time, 200 years, at least the bulk of that 200-year period after 1763, the Catholic Church was very interested in keeping their parishioners down on the farm where they could be controlled, pay, donations, tithe, whatever you want to call it. And I think some of it is the secularization stuff is kind of a slap against the Catholic Church, but it affects any religious symbol. So if you're a Sikh, wearing the turban would be out of question. Or wearing the hijab if you're a Muslim woman. That's kind of sort of not. And there's all sorts of court challenges going on, and it's not resolved yet. And it's definitely causes a lot of friction right now between the federal government and the provincial government. Just a couple of other notes. The KGB, probably just so that they don't want to, we don't want to look like we're even close to being involved. Try to plant a story with papers in Montreal and elsewhere. The whole FLQ incident was a CIA false flag operation. In other words, the CIA was providing, money, support, what have you, to the FLQ to disrupt Canada. Now, if you look at the Matrokin archive, which I'm not going to say is reliable, there's definitely some material in there that indicates that at least the KGB was talking or trying to talk to the FLQ. Maybe they gave them money. It's not reliable information, I guess is the best way to say it. I was trying to find the actual book, which I have somewhere behind me, or maybe it's in another room full of bookshelves, but I couldn't find it to look up that particular section. But the quality of the stuff that they were giving was so bad that, I mean, anyone who looked at it could see that it was basically fake. And now, Merle, you can release the hounds, and is there more questions?
Okay, folks, we're opening the floor for more questions. And while we're waiting for those, I'll mention a couple of things I did a quick lookup on. We've got about 8.4 million people living in Quebec province now. And from the last available data, which seems to go from 2016, that's out on Wikipedia, about 70% of that are Canadian or French by their background.
Yes.
So that means, basically you're looking at about 30% non-French speakers, kind of, sort of. Although they're showing that.
I think the best way to say that is that French is not the language that they learn at home first. I think that's a better way to say that. Now, from my perspective, I have a number of cousins and aunts and uncles who didn't leave when my dad did. They're still there. They still live in Montreal or north of Montreal. But of my cousins, 3 live in Quebec out of, and then there's another 4. Sorry, I'm thinking hard. One's in the Yukon, one's in British Columbia, one's in Ottawa, and one's in Ontario.
The other thing that's kind of interesting when I look at the basic info, although some of it's dated, is showing the 2016 Canadian census showed that of immigrants, the top 4 countries for immigrants in order were France, Haiti, Morocco, and Algeria.
Well, again, where French is the language you speak at home, you would have learned first, which makes it easy for them. And the government of Quebec encourages that, right? If you're going to immigrate to Quebec, they will encourage people from those countries and not actively discourage, but perhaps give you less priority if French is not your first language.
So I don't see any other questions. So unless we get one very quickly, we'll plan to close out.
Okay.
We want to thank everybody for joining us. highlight again that NSDM is a not-for-profit group that has all volunteers. And basically, we've got 10 more presentations coming up over the weekend, and we'd love to have you join us. Looks like Doug has a comment. Let's see real quick what that is. He remembers being told in 1998 that many of the business people in Montreal were resisting the language laws, especially in reference to signage, as vigorously as they could in protest against the province's laws. How's that going now?
Well, okay, I'm now going to speak very harshly of one particular French provincial governmental agency called the Office de la Langue Française. And they are the guys who go out and measure signs and say, this, the French is too small, right? There's actual rules about the French font size versus the English or other language font sizes. And I'm quite serious. And every few years, these OLF guys, also known derisively, especially amongst the English-speaking community, as the tongue troopers, they stick their foot in it by going and hassling. The last one I remember that got some press was they were hassling an Italian restaurant that was publishing their menu and the meals in the menu in Italian, right? So they were insisting, and they got talked off the ledge eventually. They were insisting that, no, you can't do that. It has to be in French. Well, it's an Italian restaurant, so eventually they sort of finally figured out that they were making themselves look worse than they can. It's government bureaucracy kind of at its worst, those guys, because you have to justify your existence. And they would go and measure signs and measure the font size and that kind of thing. And it still exists to this day. But probably because they haven't been too embarrassing in the last few years. But it does happen. And there's fines involved and that kind of stuff. You have to fix the sign. So you might have to be told, cover it up, take it down, get one that meets the requirements. In the 90s, there was a lot of pushback, even from the start, honestly. One of the arguments they would make is, my customers are entirely, English speakers. No French speaker comes in here because they don't want what we're selling. That was one of the arguments. But that's, I don't know if that's necessarily valid, because of course you're meaning that you're not going to cater to them from that point of view. So it could be sort of fiscal suicide.
Okay, well, that's all we've got. But thank you, Mike. As always, it's wonderful to hear from you and the research that you've been done, because this has become a real avocation for all of us. It's kind of sad, really.
And what, we're on at 10 tomorrow morning. I thought it was 10 tomorrow night, so I got, a little bit of a break, but no.
10 tomorrow morning is the last battles of the Second World War. And that's going to be a real montage because we have a number of folks there. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. And we're going to end the broadcast. Have a wonderful and safe weekend. And try to join us at one of our other sessions. Bye for now.